The wind howled across the mountain cliffs of Taygetus, carrying with it a chilling echo, a sound that the people of Sparta believed was the cry of the unworthy. At the base of that mountain, where the rocks fall into an endless black gorge, a legend was born. They called it the Apothetei, the place of rejection. And according to ancient whispers, it was here that Spartan infants were thrown to their deaths. Why? Because in Sparta, weakness was a crime, and the punishment was silence. Centuries later, historians still ask, did the Spartans truly kill their own children, or was this one of history's darkest exaggerations? To find the truth, we must first step back into the world of ancient Sparta, a city unlike any other in Greece. Around the 7th century BCE, Sparta transformed itself into a living weapon. Its people lived not for art or philosophy or wealth, but for war. Every law, every ritual, every heartbeat in that city pulsed toward one single purpose: to create perfect soldiers. This transformation was said to have begun under the guidance of Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver. No one knows if Lycurgus truly existed, or if he was myth, a name given to a revolution. But his so-called Great Retra, the Spartan Code, reshaped the city forever. In this brutal code, life itself was subject to inspection. When a child was born, the father didn't name it, the state did. Newborns were taken before a council of Spartan elders, the Gerousia, who examined them closely. If the child was strong, it was given back to the family to be raised for war. But if the child appeared weak, deformed, or ill, the elders passed judgment. And that's where the story turns dark. According to Plutarch, writing centuries later in his Life of Lycurgus, such children were taken to the foot of Mount Taygetus and thrown into a chasm, a ritual act of purification meant to keep Sparta's bloodline untainted. He wrote, if after examination the child was ill-born or deformed, they sent it to the so-called Apothetei, a chasm under Taygetus, thinking it better for the child and for the state that it should die. It's one of the most horrifying accounts in ancient literature. But could it really be true? To understand, we must look deeper into Spartan society, a place where survival was everything. At the age of 7, Spartan boys were torn from their families and thrown into the agoge, the state-run training system that molded them into warriors. They learned to fight, to endure hunger, to steal without being caught. They were taught never to cry, never to show fear, never to retreat. Even their mothers would say, come back with your shield or on it. So yes, a society that demanded absolute strength. But does that necessarily mean they practiced infanticide? Some modern historians argue that the story of the Taygetus chasm might have been propaganda, a myth told by rival Greek cities like Athens, who saw Sparta as barbaric and inhuman. They point out that no physical evidence of such a baby pit has ever been found. The gorge under Mount Taygetus, known as Kaidas, was indeed used by Spartans, but not for infants. Archaeologists found adult skeletons there, prisoners of war, criminals, traitors, not newborns. So, was the story of the children a lie? It's possible that the throwing away was symbolic. Perhaps weak infants weren't executed, but simply left to die naturally or even abandoned, a common practice in the ancient world. Greek cities like Athens also practiced exposure, leaving unwanted infants outside the city walls. Sparta may have done the same, but its mythic reputation for harshness turned the tale into something monstrous. Still, one detail refuses to die. Ancient sources insist that Sparta's obsession with physical perfection went beyond what any other Greek state dared. They saw deformity not as misfortune, but as moral failure, a stain that could spread through generations. And in a society where the body was everything, where warriors were gods, perhaps mercy itself was seen as weakness. But here's where the story twists again. Even as we doubt Plutarch's account, other clues appear, darker, quieter ones. Ancient Greek travelers wrote of hearing cries at night from the gorges of Taygetus. Roman visitors claimed to have seen offerings left there, small tokens, dolls, and charms, as if mourning something unseen. And local shepherds spoke of a curse that hung over the mountain, a whisper that those who entered the pit would never return. Could it be that beneath myth and exaggeration, some form of ritual once existed? A ceremony of judgment, perhaps, not of murder, but of selection. Because to the Spartans, the line between strength and purity was sacred. And perhaps in their pursuit of perfection, they crossed it, believing that only by sacrificing the weak, they could save the whole. And yet, beneath the legend of cruelty, a deeper question rises. Was Sparta truly evil, or simply a mirror of our own obsession with power and purity? Because if the myth of the Taygetus sacrifices is false, why did it survive for over 2,000 years? What truth hides behind a story that refuses to die? The wind that rushed through Mount Taygetus carried more than cold. It carried memories. Memories of fear, of judgment, of a world that believed perfection was worth any price. But to uncover whether the child sacrifices of Sparta were myth or truth, we must descend deeper into the heart of Spartan law, faith, and fear. The foundation of this legend rests on one man, Lycurgus, the lawgiver of Sparta. He was said to have shaped the entire Spartan way of life, the Rhetra, their unwritten constitution. His rules turned Sparta into something closer to a living machine than a city. Wealth was banned, equality was forced, and every citizen existed only for the good of the state. Even family ties were weak because to the Spartans, the only true family was the army. When Lycurgus introduced his reforms, he demanded that all things unfit for war be removed: cowardice, luxury, weakness, and deformity. This was the origin of the Taygetus story, or so the ancients claimed. But Lycurgus himself exists in a haze of legend. He may have lived in the 8th century BCE, or he may have been a myth created to justify Sparta's brutal customs. Even Plutarch, who wrote about him in the 1st century CE, admits, concerning Lycurgus, there is nothing that can be said which is not disputed. Still, he's said to have traveled widely, to Crete, Egypt, and even Asia Minor, gathering laws, learning, and rituals. And it was after his return, the story goes, that Sparta began its transformation into the most feared society in the Greek world. A society that worshipped discipline more than compassion, and obedience more than love. So when a child was born imperfect, it wasn't just biology, it was impiety. Allowing weakness to live was seen as defying the very will of the gods. And in that belief, the mountain became a kind of altar. It's something doesn't fit. Spartans were deeply religious. They believed every soul had value in the eyes of their gods, especially the goddess Artemis Orthia, protector of children and childbirth. Would they really throw infants to their deaths when their religion emphasized purity and divine order? Some scholars suggest that the sacrifice wasn't literal at all, but ritualized. A symbolic act, perhaps a presentation at the mountain, where the weak were left for a time, and only those who survived were accepted. It wouldn't be the first time such a ritual existed. In many ancient cultures, newborns were tested by nature, left in the cold, bathed in icy water, or exposed to the elements for a night. Those who lived were seen as chosen by the gods. Could the same have been true for Sparta? If so, then Mount Taygetus wasn't a place of murder, but a place of trial. Still, not everyone accepts that explanation. The Romans, centuries later, repeated the tale of the baby pit as absolute truth. Writers like Pausanias and Diodorus Siculus both described the chasm as a place of death, and Roman soldiers visiting Laconia swore they saw bones deep inside the gorge. Modern excavations at Kaidas, near ancient Sparta, have indeed found human remains, but these belong to adults. Archaeologists identified battle wounds, shackles, and weapon fragments among the bones, evidence that this was an execution site, not a place for infants. So the mystery deepens. Could it be that the story of throwing babies from Taygetus was invented later, a way to justify Sparta's cruelty or to demonize their militarism? Athenians, after all, despised Spartan values. They mocked their simplicity, their silence, their worship of strength. To them, telling stories of child sacrifice was a perfect way to paint Sparta as savage, a society stripped of humanity. But even if the act never happened, the belief behind it was real. Spartans lived by a law that said, the weak must not survive. From the cradle to the grave, that rule shaped their world. At age 7, boys entered the agoge, a brutal military school. They were starved, beaten, and made to steal. If caught stealing, they were punished not for theft, but for being clumsy. Pain was a teacher, and mercy was weakness. They slept on reeds cut by their own hands, bathed in cold water, and marched barefoot through snow. By age 12, they had learned to kill without hesitation. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was training for survival. To them, comfort made a man soft. Hardship made him divine. But the cost of such perfection was immense. A Spartan's life was not his own. Every heartbeat belonged to the state. Every child, every mother, every soldier, a tool for the collective. Even women were expected to embody strength. Spartan mothers exercised while pregnant, endured childbirth without aid, and raised their sons to face death with joy. When their husbands or sons went to war, they offered one warning, with your shield or on it. This wasn't just a saying. It was a promise that death was honorable and failure was unforgivable. So perhaps the real sacrifice in Sparta wasn't that of children on a mountain, but of humanity itself. A civilization that worshipped strength so fiercely that it left no room for the fragile, the tender, or the kind. Still, the image of Mount Taygetus, cold, silent, eternal, lingers in the imagination. Because legends, no matter how false, are born from truths we fear to face. Maybe the story of the baby pit survives because it captures something real, not in history, but in the human heart. A truth that even today makes us shiver. That in the pursuit of perfection, we might be willing to destroy the imperfect. But there's one more piece of the puzzle, one that lies buried beneath the mountain itself. Recent excavations have uncovered a new clue, something that might finally reveal what truly happened at Taygetus, and what the Spartans may have been hiding all along. The story could have ended there, as just another ancient myth, whispered through centuries by enemies of Sparta. But sometimes, the earth keeps secrets longer than memory itself, and when it begins to reveal them, history trembles. In 2018, a team of Greek archaeologists began excavating deeper into the Kaidas Gorge, the place where Roman records claimed unfit infants were cast down. What they found, however, changed everything. At first, they uncovered skeletons bound in iron, skulls with deep fractures, and bones bearing marks of execution. This confirmed what earlier researchers suspected. Kaidas was no nursery of infants, but a prison of death. Then came something stranger. Mixed among the adult remains were tiny bones, not enough for a baby, but unmistakably juvenile. A boy perhaps 12 or 13 years old, too young to be a warrior, too old to be an infant. Next to his skeleton was found an ivory carving, showing a young figure standing before a goddess, likely Artemis Orthia, the protector of Spartan youth. The carving's edges were burned, its surface darkened by age, but the image was clear. The child was offering something to the goddess, his own hand. It matched something written by Plutarch centuries ago, that Spartan boys, in their brutal Artemis Orthia rites, were beaten and bled before her altar, sometimes until death, to prove their strength and devotion. Could these child bones be from that ritual? If so, then the line between sacrifice and training was dangerously thin. In the name of discipline, Sparta had blurred it until it no longer existed. To understand why, we must remember what Sparta feared most. Not Persia, not Athens, not even death. Their greatest fear was decay, the slow rot of comfort, greed, and weakness. They believed all other cities had fallen because they grew soft, and so they built a society meant to outlast human frailty. Every rule, every punishment, every ritual, even the legend of Taygetus, existed to remind them that the individual was nothing. Only the state was eternal. To be born in Sparta was not a gift. It was a burden, a lifelong test to prove your worth to the city. And for those who failed, there was no mercy. Archaeologists today call the Taygetus myth a story of identity, a legend that told Spartans who they were. It may not have been literal child sacrifice, but it functioned like one. Every citizen was taught that their survival came from the destruction of the weak. Every Spartan child knew that the mountain waited, not for their bodies, but for their failures. So even if no baby ever fell from its cliffs, every heart in Sparta grew up under its shadow. But there's another possibility, one more haunting still. Some ancient accounts mention that Taygetus wasn't used only for infants or criminals. It was said to be a gate to the underworld, a sacred place where offerings were sent to appease chthonic gods, those who ruled beneath the earth. If this is true, then the remains found at Kaidas may not mark executions at all, but ritual offerings. Offerings not of war, but of faith. A desperate plea for Sparta's protection. A city so obsessed with survival that it might have sacrificed its own sons to keep the gods satisfied. No written law confirms this. No record survives. But silence in ancient Greece often hid the most sacred truths. And the Spartans were masters of silence. So myth or truth? The answer, as always with Sparta, lies between the two. No solid proof of systematic child sacrifice has ever been found. Yet everything about their culture suggests they believed in the idea, even if they never practiced it literally. They lived as if the myth were real, as if every weakness deserved to die on that mountain. And perhaps that belief is what made them so powerful and so doomed. Because a society that kills its compassion to preserve its strength is a society that cannot survive its own perfection. Today, when you visit the slopes of Mount Taygetus, the wind still hums through its canyons like a voice from another world. Locals say you can hear cries echoing in the night, faint, distant, almost human. But maybe those are not the voices of children. Maybe they are the whispers of a people who sacrificed everything for greatness and vanished. Sparta's glory lived on, but its soul died long before its city fell. And in that silence, between truth and legend, one question remains. Who decides what must be sacrificed for strength? And when strength becomes the real sacrifice?